Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Story of Us. I'm your host, Seth Chagi, and today we are going to be bringing the story of our shared past to the present. Tonight, we are joined by Dr. Ian Tattersall, curator emeritus of the American Museum of Natural History, whose scholarship on human evolution, primate diversity, and cognition has reshaped how we think about what it means to be human. In this conversation, we'll travel from ancient fossils to the emergence of symbolic thought and the art of our ancestors left behind, exploring how meaning, mind, and material culture intertwine. Dr. Tattersall, thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
And we are so happy that you are here as well. I don't know if you remember, and this is actually the first episode of season either 5 or 6 of this show. So hello, everyone, and welcome back. But I don't know if you remember, years ago, I want to say 6 or 7 years ago, when I first started this series of interviewing professors and researchers, it was not in a video format. It was a purely text-based format. And I actually emailed you about 10 to 15 questions, and you were very happy to fill it out and send it back to me. And you were one of the very first people that I ever talked to, branching out almost out of high school. And it was not high school, oh my gosh, I'm way older than that. Out of my AA.
You up.
And it's so exciting for me that I feel like this is almost a reunion in the making, having this on camera now and getting to ask these questions. So how are you? How are you?
How am I? Well, fortunately, I'm sitting down. I broke my hip recently, so I'm looking around. But sitting down, I'm doing very well.
Well, I apologize for the injury, but I'm glad to hear that you are okay, at least while sitting. And so why don't we start talking a little bit about, for those of you who might not know, your background, starting maybe with your most recent position, and then how your career led up to that in this brief or as an extended version as you would like. I know everyone is very interested.
Well, my most recent position was actually my first professional position. I came right out of graduate school to the American Museum of Natural History, and to a large extent, I learned on the job. This has been a wonderful environment to be in for an evolutionary biologist, and very, very interesting times for an evolutionary biologist. I'm very grateful for what the American Museum has exposed me to and permitted me to do. I got here via a graduate school at Yale with Elwyn Simons, and prior to that, an undergraduate stint in Cambridge with David Pilbeam. So I came from a very, very different kind of intellectual milieu at Cambridge and Yale to the American Museum.
What do you think was the biggest difference in the way academia was perhaps perceived or performed? That doesn't sound right. Done, how academia was worked on over there versus coming to the United States. Then,
well, sure. One thing about the UK is that it is very, very neo-Darwinist. And I was sort of initiated into the very strictly selectional neo-Darwinian kind of view of evolution. And that was what I was also exposed to at Yale. But when I came to the American Museum, there were 2 real revolutions in progress happening right here. One of them, of course, was the notion of punctuated equilibria, which was developed here by Niles Eldredge and popularized with Steve Gould. And that was a real revolution in the way of looking at evolutionary process. And at the same time, Gary Nelson and Don Rosen and people in the ichthyology department here were carrying out the cladistic revolution, which was a revolutionary way of really of looking at how to do systematics and how relationships among organisms ought to be determined and reconstructed. And so these two things are going along at the same time. They were, by the way, completely unrelated. There was a lot of confusion at the time between punctuated equilibria and cladism. But in fact, the two movements, as it were intellectually independent and being carried out by different groups of people. But both of them here at the American Museum. So it was extraordinary. I went from being in graduate school in geology at Yale, where the plate tectonic revolution was sort of working itself out at that time, to this very intellectually sort of febrile milieu here at the American Museum. So those were very exciting times indeed.
That sounds like a very exciting time to be diving into the American field of anthropology. And going back to your personal studies as a student, I know that you did a lot of research on lemurs in Madagascar. And I know that for at least a lot of what I've looked at from when biological anthropologists do work on lemurs and perhaps South American monkeys and whatnot, there seems to be a large gap between how they view humans, their studies with humans, and perhaps these other more distant relatives. But from what correct me if I'm wrong, from what I see from your work, you think there are definitely many ways that we can learn about us from our studies of these distant relatives. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a little bit.
That's right. It's been pretty much accepted since at least the 1960s and acknowledged by other people before that you really cannot understand human beings except in the wider context in which they evolved and the wider context in which they exist. We are not a phenomenon that can be studied in isolation. And it was because of that I became interested in lemurs. And I was initially interested in fossil, the subfossil or recently extinct lemurs in Madagascar. But when I went to Madagascar to study the collections of these fossils, I took the opportunity to go out in the field and see actual living lemurs in their natural habitat. And it was kind of like love at first sight. It was an extraordinary experience. And I knew that was really what emotionally what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, it didn't work out for me to continue working on living lemurs for more than a few years because the 1974 revolution happened in Madagascar that basically brought lemur studies to a halt for a decade. And that's when I went back into paleoanthropology where I'd started.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the ideas that might have been more popular earlier in your career compared to now, especially, and one that I believe you've helped a good amount with the change in tone and the shift from, is that hominins do not come from a linear timeline where there was one hominin and then another with an absence of other hominins. Yep. What led you to first think this way, especially as time, I mean, I know as time went on, this became more accepted, but in the earlier days when, especially even when we look at, for example, the logo of the Leakey Foundation, where we still have the walk of whatever that's called, the walk of man. How did those thoughts change and where do you see us now?
Well, this is what the study of lemurs taught me, because you can't go to Madagascar and look at lemurs without realizing instantly how diverse they are. And it became very rapidly evident to me that, in fact, the view that I've been taught of human evolution as a sort of the struggle of a single lineage from primitiveness to perfection was very much not what you go out there in nature and observe happening. The lemurs very clearly made me aware of the importance of diversity in in nature, and made me realize that in fact there really was no reason to think otherwise of human beings. That there's this notion of a single a single gradually modifying lineage over the years is an artifact of human perception rather than something that you can see actually evidenced in the fossils themselves.
So, out of the modern ways of referring to the human family, which do you think is the most accurate? A tree, a bush, a braided stream? Which do you prefer to communicate with?
I well, it depends on the level of granularity at which you're looking, really. We have to remember that the hominin group is very recently evolved, and everything that belongs to it is very closely related.
Mhm.
And among very close relatives, you can have a certain amount of braiding of lineages, if you want to put it in those terms, but nothing of real permanent evolutionary interest has happened until a lineage goes in its own direction. And so speciation is really the key to understanding the university, the diversity that we see in in the modern world, and that's why I prefer the bush image. Yes, there is a bit of braiding at very high levels of resolution, but you step back a little bit and look at the larger picture and at what lasts in an evolutionary sense, and we're looking at a bush. What we're certainly not looking at is a ladder.
Yes, I think almost all of us are definitely in agreement, hopefully, on that point.
Mhm.
Now, another area that you have spent a good deal of focus on is modern humans' cognition and perhaps where that originated from, how that came to be. And in one of your books, or you mention how we, as we all know, modern humans are a very symbolic species.
Mhm.
We, from pareidolia to looking at other images in clouds to hearing things and making our own symbols and abstract thoughts. But you make a very important point that other species that are progenitors did not do this, as far as we know, to the extent that we do. And you have some interesting thoughts on how that all came to be. And I would love if you shared some of them.
Yeah, we tend to I think to too readily use ourselves since we're the only living hominid or hominin. We tend to use ourselves as a kind of a model for what a hominin is, and I think that's very misleading because, in fact, I think it's very recently that humans began to be a completely different kind of cognitive entity than any of their hominin relatives. I think the thing that we need to remember is that you can be extremely smart and be a very extremely smart hominin without thinking in the way that we do. We
Mhm.
tend to project ourselves onto our relatives, and I think we do that at our peril. You can be extremely sophisticated and technologically accomplished and interact with the world in a very complex way without being us. And we're very arrogant. We feel that if you're going to be a really smart hominin, you have to be the way we are. And I don't think that is the case. our closest relatives in the hominin record, were very, very smart indeed. But they didn't reason in a symbolic manner in the way in which we do. And that is not to diss them in any way. That's not to try to diminish them. Um, I think that every extinct hominin deserves its own identity as itself, as a very specific interactor with the environment and part of the overall hominin story. But that doesn't mean that if they were really smart, they were some version of ourselves.
I very like the way that you put that. It makes a lot of sense. And I think it is also important to highlight the idea of human exceptionalism and kind of what you mentioned earlier about how humans don't exist in a vacuum, especially our understanding of them. We have to look at the wider picture. And I think giving identity to hominins that have been long extinct is a great effort that needs to be looked into more. Speaking on that, since I'm doing my studies in the Iberian Peninsula, the Neanderthals are, of course, on my mind. And I think that's who you were talking about when you mentioned our closest extinct hominin relatives. Where do you think they landed on an abstract scale? They might not have reasoned like us, but do you think they reasoned abstractly at all?
I think that intuitive. I think that basically Neanderthals were about as sophisticated an expression of intuitive cognition as you can get. We are symbolic, and therefore what we do is we look at our environment and we deconstruct it into a vocabulary of symbols, of words, and we can then recombine those symbols to make new versions of the world that only exist in our minds, that don't necessarily exist out there. I'm not sure Neanderthals did this. They had a very powerful intuitive understanding of the world. I think there's no question about it. And on an intuitive level, they may actually have been more perceptive than we are. But the ability to envision alternatives and therefore to plan in a sophisticated manner really demands a symbolic way of manipulating information. And I think that was the key difference between us and them, and what made them ultimately less successful in the competition for ecological space than our early relatives were.
And going along with that, how do you think that symbolic mind first evolved, and why did it take until our species to reach the level it did?
This is a terribly good and interesting question, and it's a very complicated one. We, I think, are misled by the fact that there is no doubt that from the very beginning of the very origin of our human genus Homo, there has been a tendency towards brain enlargement. You know, from about 2 million years ago until very, very recently, the trend has been in aggregate for hominin brains to become larger. And there was definitely something out there and some way in which hominins were interacting with the world that conduced or that made it advantageous for brains, which are a very expensive luxury to have, in fact. But it made it worthwhile for them to be evolved, and there was something out there that created this this situation. I think that is very, very different from what happened in the origin of symbolic cognition, because I think what was happening as brains got bigger was that intuitive intelligence was non-declarative intelligence, if you want to call it that, was increasing. And the hominins were getting smarter and smarter and smarter. The thing about symbolic cognition is that it is a qualitatively different way of processing information about the world than intuition. And because of that, we have to look for a different mechanism at work in the origin of specifically our kind of symbolic reasoning than we have to look for as a driver of hominin brain enlargement over the course of the Pleistocene. And I think that what happened was, since you cannot have a new behavior without having the anatomy that permits it already. I mean, you can't conjure a new anatomy into existence just because it would be a nice thing to have. You have to deal with what is there. And so evolution is very largely a matter, evolutionary change is a matter of recruiting what is there in new contexts. It's not simply a matter of adding new things additively, one after the other in an accumulative manner. It's taking what's there already and using it in a new way. And I think that is the key to the origin of symbolic cognition. And that we adventitiously acquired a brain that was capable of symbolic cognition, i.e., it had the internal connectivity, which is necessary for symbolic cognition, but that it was initially acquired in some other context entirely than symbolic cognition, and that symbolic cognition must therefore have been stimulated into existence by some cultural stimulus, because the biology had to be there already. You have to have had the biology to become symbolic, but to actually bring in this new behavior, you needed some kind of stimulus, which was necessarily cultural. And I think that was the invention of language, because language maps perfectly onto symbolic cognition in the sense that it depends on a very discrete vocabulary of or turning your environment into a vocabulary of discrete symbols. It's what we do in language. It's what we do when we think in a symbolic manner.
And if you had to put a time frame on that within our species history, when would that have occurred?
I think the biology must have been there, obviously, and the obvious place where it was acquired was at the origin of our very anatomically distinctive species, Homo sapiens. Homo sapiens is very different from other hominins. We know a lot about the evolutionary context of Neanderthals, for example. You know, we have pre-Neanderthals, we have Neanderthal relatives out there in the record. We don't have anything that's anything like that for Homo sapiens yet. Maybe that's because the Homo sapiens evolved in Africa, which is a large and still underexplored continent, and we can hope to find a better fossil record as time passes. But right now, what we do know is that Homo sapiens is extremely distinctive. And it was most likely in acquiring that very greatly distinctive anatomy of ours that we acquired the brain that was capable of making the associations necessary for symbolic thinking. When you had that, and that, so we're looking there at what the earliest modern human fossils now 225,000 years old, so 250,000 years or whatever it is that when Homo sapiens first arose would be when the biology was acquired. But for a while, there's nothing very revolutionary in the archaeological record to suggest that anything unusual was happening. And then suddenly, in the period between about in the late Middle Stone Age in Africa, you're getting all kinds of things happening that didn't have any equivalents earlier. Uh, you had bodily decoration. You had some very highly sophisticated uh, uh, technological developments which required forethought. You had all sorts of things happening, and then culminating in a very short time in representational art, um, which is probably the best example you could hope for of symbolic representation in the mind. So suddenly, in this period between about, say, 100,000 years ago and about 70,000 years ago, 60,000, something really important is happening. And in the hominin lineage, or in the Homo sapiens lineage, which is different from anything else happening among the hominins. And I'm pretty sure that the stimulus for this behavioral change was the invention of language, probably by children in the context of play, because language is something so radical. It's really hard to imagine it being invented by an adult who'd already grown up to think of the world as being a certain way.
That makes a lot of sense. And I really like that last part about language potentially being created by children. Watching my son, who's about to turn a year and a half, just go through life, he
Mhm.
definitely is seeing the world in a way I do not, and thinking of things
Mhm.
I do not. And
Right, right.
imagining a group of them together, I'm sure they come up with quite a few things. Now, you really got my mind thinking. So let's, I mean, hopefully this is a result, but let's say the continent of Africa gets much more funding for research
Mhm.
into unexplored areas, and we do find what would perhaps be this species that you were referring to, of something very akin to a Homo sapiens, like very akin to us, but not us. What do you think that would look like?
Well, it would obviously have to have some of the characteristics that we associate with Homo sapiens in order to make the association between the two. What it wouldn't look like are those strange hominins that occupy the very northern strip of Africa, right along the North African coast. There's something strange going on there too. Um, but it would have been a sub-Saharan phenomenon. The extent to which it would have actually our closest, I guess you have to call it not our ancestor, but our closest relative that we could identify, um, would have to have some of the features that we have, that we recognize ourselves by today. But we just don't know um, if, in fact, all of our strange features, say in our cranial conformation, we have these strange small faces that are retracted underneath the front of a very globular skull. This may all be attributable just to a minor change, an early fusion of Bainey's feet. I mean, early fusion of the base of the skull, for example. Um, we really don't know. My intuition, and this is all it is that Homo sapiens was born from something that didn't look particularly like Homo sapiens in one developmental change. And that all of the things, including the gracility of the overall gracility of the skeleton, the narrowness of the body, the barrel-shaped um, torso, and all these things are all somehow related, and we don't know exactly how they're related at the genomic level. But I'm inclined to think they came as a package rather than piecemeal. If they came as a package, we may never find an ancestor that was sort of partially us. If they came piecemeal, we could look for ancestors that looked somewhat like us, but not completely like us. So I wouldn't really want to predict. Is I guess my answer to the question.
So going back to the idea of symbolic and abstract thought, especially once again in reference to Neanderthals, some would argue that there is some evidence that there are a few examples of what could be attributed to Neanderthal rock art. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it is? And if it is, what do you think it could? There's no guessing what it could mean, but how would it differ from what a modern human would do if they were both making rock art to whatever levels they were?
Everything that has so far been identified as possible artistic product of the Neanderthals has not been convincingly representational in any way. And we know that the early Homo sapiens was big into the production of abstract symbols as well. So I don't know quite know what that would mean, but what I think is certainly the case is that anything that Neanderthals, who were very similar to us, they were extremely similar to us, might have done that we might also have done would not have been done with the same intentionality as we would have done them. So I think the jury has to remain out, and this is a question that has to remain open for the time being. But if you look at the Neanderthal record, it is very different from the record that Homo sapiens left. And there's something happening with Homo sapiens. There's a restlessness, there's an exploratory aspect to Homo sapiens that we simply don't see in the Neanderthals.
Do you think that wanderlust that Homo sapiens has had has been good for our species or bad for us in the long run?
Well, when you say good for our species, I mean that is kind of narrowing the field down. I certainly hasn't been good for any other species.
No, yeah.
We Homo sapiens is a kind of a wild card on the ecological stage, and in a very, very short time, Homo sapiens has been able to do an amazing amount of damage to the environment and show an amazing amount of imbalance with the environment. Imbalance caused by proximate causes, which may have been very very highly focused and highly inventive, but nonetheless, in aggregate, have produced a very parlous situation in the ecological world. So on balance, what Homo sapiens has done, which none of the other hominins, as far as we know, has kind of upset the apple cart. It's put this this loose cannon that's rolling around on the ecological stage, which is really unprecedented by any other species, as far as I know.
Switching gears slightly, for science communicators and science educators working with young people, when they're telling the human story through such things as art, rock art, symbolism, where do you think they go wrong in ways that might lead to ambiguity? And how do you think we can get back on track, so to say?
Well, I think it comes down to your point about human exceptionalism. I think that one of the big problems has been that since modern humans are unquestionably exceptional, they are not um, organisms that play games, the ecological game by the normal rules. Um, because the product is exceptional, we may think that, well, maybe the process that produced us was exceptional too. And I think that's where we go wrong. I think that humans were produced by perfectly routine, um, evolutionary and ecological processes. It's just that the adventitiously the product seems to have been exceptional. And I think we have to make that distinction. And I think it'll make it a lot easier for everybody to understand that we can apply, what we know about evolutionary process equally to Homo sapiens without having to look for some special explanation.
And you've written extensively both in academia and for popular audiences. How do you balance complexity and with the need for clarity in engaging with public communication?
Well, the more that I've written, the more that I realize that much of the time I'm writing for myself. I write to try to understand my own my own feelings about things. So writing about issues like this is a wonderful way of arriving at some kind of clarity for one's own sense, own self. And if I'm writing for me, I want it to be clear. I'm not a particularly complex person capable of manipulating extraordinary abstractions. I can't do that. I have to keep it basically down to earth to follow it myself. And I think that's what most people do. And hopefully, it makes it possible for me to communicate what I'm trying to communicate with adequate clarity.
I'd say so far it's been working pretty well for you. Hopefully, I from what I've all my workings and research so far for this episode. Now, if you were looking ahead, what do you think is the most promising or underexplored research areas in cognition, symbology, or material culture that could potentially change? And I'm not looking for something that will reshape our understanding of human evolution, but perhaps lend more information to one of the areas we're studying.
Yeah. I always have trouble with this kind of question because my experience has always been that the really interesting things are always things that have come out of left field and were not what anybody had been expecting. And we're very lucky, to be in a field where a lot of this kind of thing happens. And this to me is what is wonderful, that anything is possible. And I wouldn't like to predict that more of the same in any particular field is going to take us in a new direction. What usually takes you in a new direction is something that you hadn't been anticipating.
So, flipping that question around, then, I suppose, what has been for you the topic or piece of research that has come from left field that has changed your thinking the most?
Oh gosh. Um, you know, historically, I think that you have to go back to the beginning, and in that case, the beginning was the notion of diversity and punctuated equilibria that I sort of blundered into when I came to the American Museum. It's a completely new way of looking at the origins of diversity in the world, and it has tremendous effect on me. And it also made me realize, that received wisdoms are very unlikely in the end to get you very far or to take you down down a new path. So I would go back all the way to that. And then, I mean, it's just been a litany of one thing after another, of new sources of information. There's all the the new technology that has come online that we had no idea about. When I got into this business, which I don't know, 55, 60 years ago, whatever it was, a long time ago now. No, we had no idea that any of this stuff was going to be coming along. And of course, there's the new thing du jour that comes up regularly, and then they become those things themselves, become part of the regular armamentarium, and you tend to take them for granted. But all of them in their day was wonderful, and there's so many examples of that.
Or going ahead, I know are you still doing research actively, or are you more in a retired role?
Well, at this stage, I'm in my grumpy old man stage, where I'm trying to put it all together. I'm trying to make a complete story, again, for myself as much as for anyone else. I'm trying to create in my own mind as complete an explanation as I can for the kind of creature that our ancestors were and that we have subsequently become. And so, no, I'm not pushing the far boundaries at this point, but I'm just trying to come up with a perspective and an overview that tries to capture as much as I can of all the many things that have gone into making human beings human.
Do you think that well, we don't want to guess about things, for discovering and putting together that overview, is there an aspect of it that you think is either for researchers or for students or for the public? Do you think there is an area that is the most critical to understand what a human is?
No, I think I understand the question, and I would I would I find this very, very hard to articulate. We don't know exactly, what happens in in when we deconstruct the world, and we don't know exactly what is going on in our minds and exactly how the higher centers of the brain interact with the lower intuitive centers of the brain, which are already there. I mean, we have basically all the brain that our ancestors had, but with an extra veneer on top of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't know how those two substrates interact in order to produce what we subjectively experience as the world. And that's something that I definitely like to know more about.
And how do you think you can maybe answer some of those questions?
Well, that is basically for people with other expertises than mine to really investigate. But there's no question that there is a qualitative difference between Homo sapiens and every other creature, as far as we know, that have existed, in the history of the planet. And it's something that was acquired very quickly and very suddenly and very recently. And to know exactly what that was, to me, would be the Holy Grail. And I can't tell you, sitting here, how to go about finding that out. But things will accumulate, and we'll learn a bit more about this, and a bit more about that, and a bit more about something else. And pretty soon, in 100 years, somebody who's as old as I am, and in the sort of same phase of life, trying to understand the larger story rather than to push the boundaries, that somebody in that position would be able actually to make a story about it.
And speaking of this future person, in 100 years down the line, what advice could you give high schoolers today, undergraduate students who are just starting out on the road of anthropology, archaeology, not only just for success, because success is only so much of the story, but of how to be good researchers and good scientists?
Well, I think the first of all, you have to be motivated to do what you want to do, and not think of it as a career thing, but to think of it as something that they're doing for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And answering questions that they generate as individuals, and the answers to which give them, or finding the answers to which gives them satisfaction. I really think it's really important not to think of things as a career track so much as some way to answer questions that arrive in yourself.
I very much like that. I very much like that. And I think with that, I will wrap up.
Okay.
Now, last question.
Mm-hmm.
What gives you the most hope in the directions that human origins research is going for the next generation that we were just mentioning of scholars and science communicators? Is it technology? Is it our better understanding?
I think it's almost any of those ingredients that you can imagine. But the best hope is that every generation, comes to or should come to these questions with an open mind, and this is where advances are going to come from. Is open minds that aren't. It's a great shame to me that sometimes there are wonderful teachers out there who grab students' imaginations, and who create fascinations, but also create ideas of how the world works, right? And I don't think teachers ought to be doing that. They shouldn't be telling anybody how the world works. They ought to be telling people how to look at the world to find out how it works. And as long as there are teachers like that out there, and there are minds that are not fixed by received wisdoms out there ready to receive that, I think there's room for lots of optimism about the future of our field.
And with that, Professor Emeritus Tattersall, thank you so much for coming on. That is a great message to leave our audience with. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me this evening.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And you've asked some really wonderful questions and made me think too. Thank you.
Of course.